This is a lecture on Asian American worship, present and future. This lecture is going to offer more of a framework on the relationship between worship and culture, or more specifically speaking, Asian American cultures, rather than a simplistic guide for here's how to conduct Asian American worship. Because as we have seen throughout this course, any such notion of a monolith Asian American culture is not possible. And Asian American worship, therefore, is a highly complex enterprise to discuss. The first thing we want to note is that worship is fundamentally contextual. At the top right corner is a picture from Dr. Russell Yee, who's the author of Worship on the Way, the book on which I am basing this lecture. And in that photo on the top right, you can see a communion table set up with white grape juice on the left and a soy milk on the right. Here's a couple more examples. These are some contextual worship that many of us might be familiar with. And here I want to highlight what Yee says in his book, Worship on the Way. He writes, "Scripture is barely descriptive, let alone prescriptive, about the particulars of form in the Lord's Supper." Or he applies that to worship across the board. Right? Yee argues in his book that you would not be able to plan a worship service, a biblical one, using only the details found in Scripture, because there's not enough details there. No church anywhere in the world worships in some quote-unquote biblical way, but rather, Yee is suggesting, churches exercise their freedom to order and to shape worship using various inherited cultural forms. So the bottom line is this: we not only have the freedom to use culture to help shape worship, we really don't have any other choice but to do so, to use the human cultures available to us. That's kind of the basic premise of Yee's book, Worship on the Way. And he goes into functions versus forms in the act of worship. And he writes, what Scripture is mostly concerned about is the object of our worship, right? The God revealed in Jesus Christ. Scripture does give us some range of functions in worship. For example, the left column, you're going to see praise. You're going to see prayer, petition, proclamation, teaching, thanksgiving, lament, and sacraments are some of the functions that we might see in the scriptural text. But on the right-hand column, all the forms of worship are largely left to us and our cultural resources. So therefore, we have a part to develop and to express the forms in which we might take part in praise or prayer or proclamation, and so on and so on. Now, this is obviously not exhaustive, but here are just some examples of the forms that one might see, whether in an ethnic-specific Asian American church or a pan-Asian American congregation or even a multi-ethnic, right? So if you look at praise and the function of praise on the left, on the right, the forms of praise within an ethnic-specific context, you might see the genre of that ethnic community in their music, their indigenous instruments, and obviously their language. Now, in a pan-ethnic Asian American context, you might see lyrics that capture the overarching Asian American narrative, but you want to avoid any ethnic monopolizing here. So you want to avoid ethnic-specific language within a pan-Asian American context. So it wouldn't be you wouldn't be affirming all the different ethnic Asian heritages there if you only on a given Sunday only sang one song in, say, Mandarin, but all the other ones in English. So you want to avoid that kind of ethnic monopolizing in a pan-Asian American context. For the function of prayer on the left, The forms might look like a posture of sitting with your legs crossed, which is not something that many of us in the West are used to seeing. But those in different parts of Asian and Asian American cultures might be more comfortable praying in that way, or kneeling on the floor or bowing on the floor might often be associated with a Muslim way of prayer. But in Scripture, you see people falling on the floor when they are around angelic beings or when they are in the presence of the Lord. So the function of proclamation or teaching, again, ethnic specific. Of course, you can preach in native language. Some of these are obvious, right? In a pan-Asian American context, teaching might take the form of a communal, describing the story through us, right, versus just me, right? Making us the characters and not just individualistic. It might be narrative-driven sermons, which kind of capture a lot of Asian American imaginations. The function of thanksgiving, that could take the form of honoring or celebrating others. It might even involve honoring or venerating ancestors without worshiping them, without placing the hope that belongs to Jesus alone and the trust that belongs to Jesus alone onto your ancestors. Lament is a function. Well, one form of lament is a communal lament. And that can look like many different ways in many different ethnic-specific or multi-ethnic contexts. Sacraments. In a pan-Asian American context, you might offer Asian American food and drink as an option for communion, as the picture earlier demonstrated with the soy milk. So the relationship of worship and culture is a subset of the larger question of the relationship between Christ and culture. So Christ and culture, hopefully that rings a bell. We've talked about Niebuhr's typologies of Christ and culture earlier in this class. And for this worship, Asian American worship and worship and culture, it kind of, can fit within the grid of Christ and culture. So in 1996, or 1996 actually, an international group from the Lutheran tradition brought several years of study and discussion together to compose a document known as the Nairobi Statement on Worship and Culture. And they posit that when conversations about worship and culture seem to come to a dead end, this document posits that leaders were dwelling too much in one area rather than using all the four categories, which are meant to complement one another. Those categories being transcultural, contextual, countercultural, and cross-cultural. Where transcultural or the universal simply alludes to the reality that some aspects of worship are true and present in all times and places and cultures. For example, the object of Christian worship as the God revealed in Jesus Christ. That's the center of all Christian worship, regardless of context and culture. The church as a missional community of believers, never just a private or enclosed gathering. That's also transcultural. The contextual, the culture embracing, where all worship involves the cultures of those gathered to worship, using those cultures as a God-given palette, Russell Yee writes, from which to create especially good, God-pleasing offerings of worship. So, for example, on the left there, you see Martin Luther's German Bible translation as a way of embracing culture. Prior to Luther's German translation of the Bible, you only had a Latin version of the Bible, and the common German person could not read that. German hymns, of course. In the middle picture is meant to reflect the Roman Catholic reforms after Second Vatican in the 1960s, where Catholic worship took a radical revolutionary turn from fixed monocultural liturgies in Latin to allow for a full range of the world's languages as part of their culture. And countercultural. Countercultural is culture rejecting. This is what Yi writes, where the gospel confronts that which is antithetical to the gospel in every culture. So Yi, a Chinese American, uses the example of foot binding of women in China as a practice that it's just antithetical to the gospel, and the gospel is going to confront that. And Yi goes on to talk about praying and worshiping with forms and objects associated with other religions, where he writes, "It seems to me that these objects, for example, the incense sticks, certain postures for meditation, chimes or bells for prayers, or specific musical genres and instruments, or even foods, are neutral in and of themselves," right? Though they may be associated with non-Christian spirituality and worship. And again, the objects and the forms are only an issue when they trouble the conscience of someone who cannot disassociate from them from the worship of other spirits and gods. So this sounds like the Apostle Paul. It makes sense. This is where Yi is getting this from, that the objects in and of themselves are neutral. This is a profound point, because a lot of times we in the West, because of colonialism, we perceive the rituals and the items and the artifacts of people outside the West as somehow intrinsically demonic, when actually they are more neutral than anything. But it's the attachment and the symbols that you add to them. Finally, cross-cultural and culture mixing, right? And this is where he draws from Bennett's model of intercultural encounters. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but he breaks it down into 6 stages. The first 3 are ethnocentric stages, and the last 3 are ethno-relative stages. And this is important because Yi locates the Asian American, what he calls Asian North American worship, within one of these 6 stages. So the first stage is denial. That's simply, cultures ignoring each other, even though they might be in the same block, but they just pretend like each other don't exist. Stage number 2, defense. Defense is acknowledging that other cultures exist, that that Church A recognizes that Church B of a different ethnicity exists, but you see them as either inferior or superior to yours. And in defense, different equals bad. Stage 3, minimization. Acknowledge the presence and the differences of other cultures in a less judgmental way than the position above, defense. But this position downplays the need to do anything differently about these differences, right? Finally, you go into the ethno-relative stages. So stage 4, acceptance. This is where different can become good, and that starts to become a possibility. All cultures treated as admirable, but also subject to critique by self and others. Adaptation, stage 5, is making space within our own settings for the forms and the values of other cultures. And finally, stage 6, integration, where we allow other cultures to actually shape and to change us and to impart a trade of identity negotiation amongst one another. We offer our culture to them, and they offer their cultures back to us in reciprocal ways. So Yi kind of concludes the state of Asian American worship. He describes it as on the way, where much of the Asian North American church is still stuck, mostly unaware, in the reverse defense stage, right? So that's the stage 2. Reverse defense, he's just saying, in the defense stage, you recognize there's the other, and you see them as inferior or superior. And in this case, Yi's saying that Asian North American worship sees itself as inferior, basically treating majority culture as better than Asian North American culture. So you all in this course get to be contributors towards Asian American worship moving forward. And I just offer this final grid here at the end just as an optional tool. This is not any part of your assignment or anything. This is just an optional tool that, as I spoke with Dr. Lee, our conversation just kind of gave birth to this mental grid for me. I decided to put it on a document and just to share it with you. If it's not helpful, no worries. If you find it to be helpful, I would encourage you to use it for the benefit of your ministry context.